I built this website using Rive and their recent Webflow integration to show you how you can use various state machine layers to create multiple rich interactions on a page. So this is one 51 kilobyte Rive file that has 5 different layers of animation going on. So we have this kind of breathing effect that's happening all the time. Then that blob is also at the same time following the mouse. Then we have these colorful pipes that are growing as you scroll down the page. And then as you hit specific points on the page, these rectangles are moving around in the background. And finally, when you hit this switch down here, we're switching from night to day mode, which you'll have seen 1,000 times, but I think it's interesting because we're changing properties in Rive while also changing native Webflow variables. This whole thing was built with just a few simple principles, and if you're interested, I'm going to walk through how I put it together. But there is also a file on the Rive community that you can remix to make your own version of this or see how I built it. You can clone this site on the Webflow showcase, and if you want, make your own version of this, try attaching the inputs to different things, or just see what you can do. I'd be interested to see if anyone does anything cool. Let's have a look at how it's set up in Webflow. So first of all, just looking at what we have in Webflow, we have navigation across the top, and we have a readout down the bottom, and then we have a background wrap, which is what contains this Rive file. We have just a fixed element here, which is filling the screen, and is z-indexed to -1 so that it's not getting in the way of anything else, it's just sitting behind. And then we have a gradient, which is overlaying the Rive file, so I just faded it out down the bottom here. And then we have the Rive file itself, and you can add one of those by just hitting Command E, typing Rive, and bringing the element in there. And then you have Rive settings over here. You can choose your file, and then you can select your artboard and state machine, and that's very important, otherwise nothing is going to work. So jumping over to Rive, just to show you how I got it out of there in the first place, once you've got your finished file, you go to export over here. You can see all the different versions that I made of this one as I was going. So when you do that and you bring your file into Webflow, what you're doing is exposing all of your inputs. So if we look at the state machine, which is a very important thing in a Rive file, you'll be able to see all of these inputs: blob, vertical, horizontal, color, snaking, light mode, and position switch. And those are the inputs that I use to control my Webflow interactions. Then we also have all of these layers of the state machine that are used to set those different animations. And all of those are referencing these animations down the side here. Now, they're called animations, but really a lot of the time I'm not doing much animating. If I look at, for example, blob down, blob left, all of these, they only have things keyed at 0 seconds. So I'm really just creating different states that then we're going to use Webflow interactions to move between. The exception to that is blob breathe. So looking at that first, you want to create a breathing blob. This is what you've got to do. Over in design, you create an artboard by hitting A and drawing the artboard and setting it to the size that you would like. And then you can hit P to use the pen tool, or click up in the top left here, and you can create a shape. So I created a simple blob shape, closed the path, and then I went in, and if you command click on each of these, they'll turn into curves, and then you can make it all blobby. So once you have the blob, you can go over to animate mode, and then what I did is create just a series of timelines depending on when the mouse is moving up, down, left, and right. So let's take, for example, if I was wanting to move everything up, we might call this blob up, and I hit edit vertices on the path, and then we're back into what we had before, but we're not changing it all the time, we're only changing it for this timeline. So what I did was go to each of these and just move them up in various ways. So I wanted it to be kind of liquidy and interesting, so I did this fairly randomly, but then also tweaked it once I'd done it. So I might want, say, this curve to come up here, so that it kind of moves through, and the same with this one. I might want it to kind of pass through that way, while this one doesn't maybe move so much, and this can give us kind of a liquidy effect once it's applied. But so what I would do here is then create the same kind of thing for blob down, blob left, and blob right. And you can see that I've done the same thing over here: blob up, blob down, blob left, and blob right. And maybe we can make that a little bit easier to see if I just change the background of this to white. And we'll just, for now, we'll hide the squares and the snakes, and you can just see the blob. So left, right, down, up. I didn't spend ages on this. I'm just demonstrating principles. You could play around with this, and I think I got quite a nice like liquidy effect, but I think you could go even further if you were so inclined. And then I created these inputs over here. So we've got blob vertical and blob horizontal. So we're going to use the two different pairs. We're going to use up and down, and we're going to use left and right. So in blob horizontal, what I did is drag in blob left. And then over here, I hit blend. And that allows me to select an input. So in this case, I want the horizontal input, and then create two timelines here. And we've got our left and our right. And we want to set right to 100 and left to 0. And you can see that this is then going to blend between those two states. So I've just drawn a line from entry through to blend. So we'll delete this new version of it. And you can see then, if I hit play on the state machine and we are on horizontal, I'm going to move that value and it's blending between the two as it moves from 0 to 100. And then the same thing on vertical. We have this state machine here, which is blending blob up and blob down in the same way. And as I move this value, you'll see it go up and down. Now, we're not actually going to be doing this animating in Rive, so let's look over in Webflow. So in the Webflow interactions panel, we just go to mouse move in viewport, and I've created this here, mouse movement. So let's look inside there. So what you have to do when you're adding Rive animations is make sure that before you hit plus up here, you've got your Rive element selected. This is really important. I keep coming across people missing this. So hit Rive there, then go up here, click plus, and then you will see Rive under integrations. Once you've got that, you will see down the bottom here, your state machine contains all of the inputs that are available to you in the Rive file. So we've got vertical, horizontal, and we've got all our other inputs as well. In this case, I've set mouse X 0% to 0 on the horizontal and on 100% to 100 on the horizontal. And then we've done the same thing on the Y-axis for vertical 0 and vertical 100. So now we get beyond those two blend states and we actually start to mix all four of them together in Webflow, which means that we get this movement. And you see that it's actually kind of dragging behind my mouse slightly, and that's intentional. I'm using the smoothing property in Webflow. I've set it to 96. If I put this all the way down to 0, then it would follow very directly and it kind of just looks a bit too instant. So I found that 96 was a nice number to make it really sort of liquidy. I wanted it to be like a big blob of ink or something. So I think that works nicely. How about we look at these pipes next, because they're done in a similar way, but using a different kind of interaction. So again, in Rive, looking at how I made these in the first place, I used the pen tool, and I actually, at the time, I think I had all of the rectangles kind of making a grid across the page. I had them all together like that, which enabled me to follow the position of those using all of these points that come up. So that's useful. But I just created these paths. You can also hold the shift key to make sure that you're going in straight lines. And then you can see this is getting fill automatically. It sort of fills by default, but you can delete that fill. You can add a stroke. I'll make it really thick so that you can see this next bit really clearly. And then on the path itself, if you edit vertices, you can just select and add corner radius to each of those so that you get those kind of bendy paths. But so the important thing is that this stroke grows as you're scrolling down the page. And the way that you do that is you have to go into stroke and set this property here to trim. So you want trim sequential. And now you can see that the stroke is completely disappeared because we've got start 0 and end 0. Whereas if you set this to 100, then it would be completely filled. So that's the thing. And then I made lots of different colored ones of these. I set various colors. So I made copies of these as well. There's a lot of reflection and symmetry going on. So an important thing there as well, you can do rotating to create that effect, or you can also use the X and Y properties to do horizontal and vertical flipping. I was looking for those actions for ages and I realized that they weren't there. but this works just the same in the scale. You can use -100 to set that. And then also it's important when you're playing around with that stuff in Rive, you might find that you want to move this kind of origin point. This control is a little bit weird to get used to as well at first. So the first bit of it will like scale your object in the dimension. The second bit of it on the outside of the circle will allow you to actually move it. The yellow circle itself will allow you to rotate it. But then if you want to move where this is, because this is the origin point for whenever you're doing animation or anything like that, then you can hit Y and then you'll be able to move this around to a new place. So say I wanted the origin point to be the middle of this and then hit Y again. Now it means that when I rotate, it's going to rotate on the spot where I want it. So those are pretty useful if you're doing lots of duplication and stuff like I did with this. So yeah, now you've got your wiggly snaky lines. What I did was head over to animate and again create pairs of timelines. So I'll jump back over to my original file for this and let's make it dark again. For the snakes, I'll even hide the blob. I have these snakes 1 and snakes 2. And all I did is select all of the snakes and on the stroke property, I'll just choose one so you can see it clearly. I've set the start to 0 and the end to 5. So actually I could have set 0 and 0, but what I did was have a little bit off the page because originally I was thinking that I wanted to have kind of a little bit moving around the whole thing. So this is something you can do as well. In the end, I preferred the effect where it just filled up and took over the screen. So you could have it all on the page, have it 0, 0 to achieve the same effect. And then when you go to the second timeline, I've set them all to 0 and 100. So that means they're fully drawn. So then in the state machine, we again use blending and we go to the snakes layer. You can see I've got a blend here. And what I did was do snakes 1, set it to blend, change the input to snaking, and then timelines would be snakes 1 and snakes 2. And that would be set to 100. And again, we're just blending between those two timelines. So you can see that same effect we've just got on this layer of it, entry straight to blend. And then when we press play and we move that up and down, that then draws our snakes. And that's what's happening as you're scrolling down the page in Webflow. So let's have a look over there. In Webflow, you're going to want a while page is scrolling interaction. I've called this one snakes. And we've got smoothing 87%. So again, that's doing a similar thing as before, only in this case, because you're scrolling down, it's like it doesn't stop as soon as you finish scrolling. The snakes kind of keep on growing a little bit afterwards, which I just think is a nice effect. So after selecting Rive over here in the navigator, I hit plus, I added Rive, and then I was able to set snaking 0 and snaking. I actually did 25. I was playing around with the speed of it and I didn't like it when I had it set all the way to 100 because they would just grow too quickly and it was a bit crazy. So I've got it set at 25. Next, let's look at these rectangles. So as I mentioned before, these are actually changing as you hit specific points on the page. So it's a slightly different type of interaction. It's not as you're scrolling all of the time, it's whenever we hit a particular moment. So since I'm in Webflow, I may as well show you that side first. Inside certain sections, so every other section, I created these position triggers, which are actually little divs, which are just 1 pixel by 1 pixel. This is a trick I learned from Vincent Pidot, Vinchubang on Twitter. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your last name right, sorry mate. But I find this really useful if you are trying to be precise with how you trigger things rather than using other elements on the page. And it also makes them easier to move around afterwards. You just create a little div, set it exactly where you want it. In this case, it's absolutely positioned inside the section and set to sort of be halfway up using the position here. And then the interaction is set on there. And this one is a scroll into view and out of view interaction. And that, let's have a look inside this one, is changing a property in Rive called position switch. So here it's keyed to, I mean, this is kind of Webflow's equivalent of keying, right? You can key things by clicking just on the property, or by, you know, I could turn it on and off as well, works. But I wanted it to be keyed off in this position. And then over in position 2, that Boolean value is going to be set ticked in Webflow. But in Rive, we use true and false because they're Booleans. So let's go and have a look at that in Rive. So in Rive, we have, again, timelines for position 1 and position 2. And I just moved the rectangles, each individual one, to a new position depending on which one it was. And this was a bit laborious. I kind of was thinking about creating different positions for every single section, but then I was kind of like, why? So we just have 2. And then in the state machine, if we look at position switch, it's a bit different. We're not using blend here. We're using both individual timelines. Remember, those timelines are just things keyed at 0, just the position, which is the X and Y for each rectangle, and that's it. There's no real animation going on. I drag those timelines in, and then in this case, you can do something kind of cool with the conditionality. So I'll just do it again over here. You draw a line between each of them, and then on one arrow, I set the condition to position switch true, and on the other one, position switch false. And that position switch I just created over here in inputs by hitting Boolean, and that gives you just something that you can turn on and off. And that's the same thing that we saw with the tick checkbox over in Webflow. So this is how that looks if you just tick and untick it over here. So normally if I'm animating and doing something just in Rive, I would be creating elements inside Rive that would be changing this. But in our case, we're doing all of that in Webflow, so we don't need to. But you could equally create a button in Rive and have that turn this on and off. And that's just another way of doing things. So finally, I used a very similar method for day and night. So you'll see this looks pretty much the same on this layer. You've got dark mode and you've got light mode. And we're using another Boolean called light mode that is moving to light mode if that one is true, and moving back to dark mode if it's false. And those timelines, as you might imagine, we're just changing the color of various elements. So if I show all of the elements here, you'll see I've changed the color of the artboard background, I've changed the color of the blob, and I've changed the color of all of the rectangles. And again, those are just keyed with the little diamond over here. And then inside Webflow, this interaction is set on this switch here. So I selected the switch and I created a mouse click tap interaction. And then for day, we have an initial state and we also have an after state. This one looks complicated, but it's actually not. It's just that I needed to also move the switch. So I'm moving it across as you click on it. I'm also changing the icon, and then I'm also changing all the stuff in the readout down there. So it looks more complicated than it is. But the Rive thing is just looking at that Boolean again, light mode, and for initial it's off, and then when I hit this, it's on. You see we're kind of halfway through the interaction here, so you're half day, half night. But if we go right to the end, you'll see it's gone all the way to day. And then on the other one, as you might guess, we've got just the same properties. I just duplicated it and used all of the stuff from the initial state, but made sure it moves back in the same way. I did have to do some syncing up here. So in Rive, I think I set a 600 millisecond change for the colors of the Rive file elements. So I just had to make sure that when I was changing variables in Webflow, I also set the same 0.6 second duration to make those line up. In Rive, it looks like this, and on the arrow, when you're on the state machine, you can set the duration to 600 milliseconds, and you can also change interpolation types, and you can have them gentle curves, or you can have bouncy elastic curves or whatever. But this one's just linear, and I've matched it in Webflow. Pretty sure I could just do all of that in Webflow, but I mean, it doesn't matter either way, really. It's just how it ended up. So I think that pretty much covers all of the interactions on this site. I just think it's interesting how starting with quite a simple idea, I didn't even really fully know what I was going to build when I started this out, but by just taking a few rectangles, taking a few shapes, I was able to do all of these different layers of interaction and associate them with different properties and end up with something that I think is fairly rich and interesting. Now, obviously, you wouldn't necessarily want such a complicated background. It's probably a bit much. You need to be careful with your animations on real sites. but hopefully this just sort of demonstrates the possibilities. There's lots of really cool things that you can do with this combination. I think I'm really interested to see what other people make. There's also so many amazing animators, and all you have to do is get them to expose these inputs to you in the way that you want, and hopefully this helps you to understand how you might collaborate with those people too. As I've mentioned, you can remix this file in the Rive community, so you can look at it there. You can also clone this site so you can try it out for yourself. You could try like tying the inputs to different types of interactions. Maybe you could have the blob move as you scroll and the pipes move with the mouse or something like that. Or, you know, you could just do your own version entirely. I'd love to see if anyone else does anything with this, but overall, I hope you learned something today and this is useful.